Thank you, Sarah. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces here today, Canadian faces. I'm really honored to have the opportunity to introduce the Canadian-Caribbean writer M. NourbeSe Philip for North of Invention. Longtime resident of Toronto, she works as a poet, playwright, essayist, fiction writer, and lawyer. Her writing engages with multiple genres, found texts, and voices to create a transformational grammar of diaspora. She's the author of numerous works, including Looking for Livingston, An Odyssey of Silence, Frontiers, Essays and Writings on Racism and Culture, A Genealogy of Resistance and Other Essays, Coups and Calypsos, and She Tries Her Tongue, Her Silence Softly Breaks. The manuscript for this last work, published in 1988, won the prestigious Casa de las Americas Prize. And one of the remarkable things about this work is how it reinvigorates the Caribbean tradition of writing in the demotic by invoking the liminal space between languages and between language and the body. And I often teach the poem Discourse on the Logic of Language from She Tries Her Tongue when I'm introducing undergraduate students to Caribbean poetry. And I will say that it is one of the most rhetorically persuasive poems that I've ever encountered in the classroom to resoundingly convince students of the ways in which language functions as a violent form of authority in the African diaspora. Her most recent book, Zong, published in 2008, illustrates NourbeSe's ongoing commitment to poetry as a radical mode of history and of racial protest. This incredible book-length long poem is a transgenerational community lyric made only of language taken from the Gregson versus Gilbert decision, a 1783 legal case resulting from the deliberate drowning of 150 slaves. As NourbeSe so eloquently describes, this is not, was, or should be. In this meditative work, prepositions and articles, rather than being the marginalia of language, become the central engines of meaning to voice the unspeakable. If in She Tries Her Tongue, the silence softly breaks, in Zong, NourbeSe makes the deafening silence of those unable to speak for themselves implode through her found text. Please welcome NourbeSe Philip.
Morning to you all, and thank you very much to Sarah Dowling, Charles Bernstein, and all the other organizers. A couple of weeks ago, I think I began to panic, and I remember sending an email to Sarah saying, it's 5 days, like, how can I be away for 5 days? And in her inimitable, calm style, well, it was always 5 days, and anyway, it's just been really, I didn't read the email very closely originally. She has just been quite amazing. And it's always, for me, when I get invited to places, I had a residency last year at the University of the West Indies. I call it the residency from hell. And I want to collect residencies, experiences of residencies like that. But the person you deal with sets the tone. And I knew from the day I had the first phone call with the woman that it wasn't going to work. So thank you. Charles, many years ago, you had me down to Buffalo. I think that was after I published She Tries Her Tongue. And I see Nicole, last time we met each other was in Germany at Literature in English, and a long time ago. It was a great party, though. We danced until the early hours. I just want to thank everyone for being here. And Lisa, I didn't want to ask questions because I was nervous about my speech, but a couple of things. When you talked about the history of words, one of the words that I've been thinking about a lot is want. The word want, because want today means what we desire. And it was only in 1720, I believe, that it shifts from lacking something to desiring. And the whole question is, do you desire what you lack, or is there something else? So that's been on my mind. And also when you talked about the poem is the speech of citizenship. For fellow Canadians, we have Rob Ford as our mayor in Toronto now, and the Americans you don't know, but I don't know how to describe him. The gravy train has to come to an end. He's very wealthy, but somehow has been able to convince, as has happened here in the States, convince those who are at the lower socioeconomic level to believe that he has their interests at heart and so on. And a couple of months ago, I did a reading at a festival, Words Aloud. And just before I went on, the mayor from this town outside Toronto, Durham, got up and read a poem. And I had this flash, this moment. What poems would I send to Rob Ford to read? You know, as the mayor of the largest city in Canada. And I do want to organize a poetry reading where we will bring up either poems we've written about Rob Ford or that we think he should read, poems that already exist. You know, I thought of E.E. Cummings because he has this mantra, you know, the gravy train must come to an end. You know, I think the gravy train must come to an end. Anyway, Rob Ford. So when I was thinking about talking here, I had a couple of ideas. I want to complicate the whole idea of Canada and me being here, albeit as a Caribbean Canadian person, because I feel very prickly when I think of myself in terms of being Canadian. The title I had a few days ago was The Reluctant Immigrant. And then I also thought I wanted to talk about the whole idea of silence and silencing and issues of constraint and limitation. I'll just see how far I can get with it. But first, I just want to reflect on this because when I looked at Sarah's original letter when she told me how long this thing was going to be, and she listed certain ideas, one of the things she wrote was reflecting on the history, challenges, and possibilities of Canadian poetry. And I suppose some may say that this is a somewhat Marxist interpretation in terms of the material conditions of creation, but I do want to reflect on that. And also, given the fact that there was that flurry of emails started by Fred about 2 weeks ago around Form 8233 and W8 Ben and what do we do if they stop us and so on. That whole idea of boundaries, borders, constraints, and so on. So I just want to give you a quick backstory of how it is. I'm so challenged in terms of these things. I just want, can you, and does it stay on? No, I have to keep doing it. Okay, you keep it and just sort of tell me when I've gone 20 minutes, because, yeah. Yeah, because the rubric of Canadian poetry is not something that I embrace or necessarily accept. And it begs the question, what is Canadian about my poetry? Is it because I live there? I've lived there for now maybe 40 years. In the sense, but one of the things that I feel is nuanced but is important for me is that I never chose to immigrate to Canada. The Caribbean, like certain places, Italy, Ireland, we've always exported people until fairly recently when, you know, the borders have become much more controlled. And I think at that age, a young adult, I could have gone to the US, I could have gone to England. I chose Canada because my then fiance was in Canada. And there's a sense in which there's a disturbing parallel with the trade in Africans, in the sense that there was a time when one could be moved anywhere around the world just by virtue of having a black skin. You know, that was the passport, so to speak. And there was a sense at that time in the early 60s where I could have ended up here in England. And one of the things I've always thought about is that had I come here to the States, one of the things that I would have had to have taken on board was your long history of African American writing, going back to the slave poet Phyllis Wheatley. If I'd gone to England as someone from the colonies at that point still, or just barely out of the colonies, there is also a long tradition of writing from the former colonial empire and Commonwealth and so on. What is interesting about Canada is having washed up on those shores, so to speak, or that airport, it seemed to me when I began writing that there didn't appear to be a tradition of writing by people like myself. Now, George Eliot Clarke, some of you know him, many of you know him, has challenged me and critiqued me on that, because he's argued and published work to the effect that there was a tradition in Nova Scotia, the sermons and so on. I still maintain, I think we're both right, I still maintain that a sort of conscious literary tradition by African Canadians was not fully formed. And I think that has led perhaps to, I suppose, why maybe I can see myself as maybe taking on some aspect of the Canadian geography, in the sense I felt like I was on the margins, but margin also means frontier. With nothing that would really crush me necessarily, as in the long tradition here, and the very sharply argued and reasoned history of African Americans. In Canada, it seemed everything was open, and I had to either collapse into the nothingness or find my place somewhere. So I began writing. I became a lawyer and began writing while I practiced law. Then gave up the practice of law. I no longer practice. In fact, I have to apply to stop being a lawyer. Can't just stop being a lawyer. And I have had to file these reports for 30-something years now, and I don't know, it's interesting. I think that the finishing of Zong has had an effect, because I think I couldn't have written Zong had I not studied law, and I think the purpose for it is over. But along with poetry, I also began writing prose, and going back to the whole idea of prosody that Lisa was talking about, as a form of activism. And I think there were two reasons for this. One is that I like making argument, and law was a really great training for building argument. But I also was aware I didn't want to make argument in poetry, and as I was moving through the lyric and moving away from that lyric assurance and questioning authority, and where do I get my authority? Do I have authority as a Black African female living in Canada? What authority do I actually work with? I didn't want to make argument, and coming from a group that, Obama notwithstanding, coming from a group that continues to engage with issues of socioeconomic justice and all those things, political representation, prisons, housing, and so on, it's very difficult to resist the burden of having to speak for the group and so on. But my engagement in the essay was a form of activism, and that was how I began to challenge the Canadian society as I experienced it. And I was also working with developing in the essay form, drawing on the resources of poetry. So in some of my longer essays, like A Piece of Land Surrounded, and others whose titles I don't recall right now, I begin to pull into the essay form, repetition and some of those resources that we tend to exploit in poetry. But there was also a very sharp and focused critique of the Canadian state, multiculturalism, writing on issues of racism, homophobia, sexism, and so on. And that activist political writing would eventually take me into a headlong collision with the CanLit establishment and a protracted media fight around PEN Canada and race and representation and so on. And many of you might be wondering, well, what is the point of all this? But it's getting me back to that idea of borders and constraints, because what the upshot of all this was, and this is not the reason for this is not to lambaste Canada or anything like that. It's simply to say that by work, I was no longer being asked to do work in Canada. And that the border began to function for me in a different way. Because the border between us, north of Invention, has been a place where, certainly in Ontario in the east, people have crossed for refuge, for freedom. During the Vietnam War, draft dodgers crossed over to Canada. Today, Afghanistan, you have some people crossing over. And we Canadians, somebody described in Now magazine that Canadians are really Americans with blue boxes and a healthcare system. But many of us like to pride ourselves on the fact that, we're so much better than you Americans down here, and, we do things so much more nicely and so on. But for me, the border meant that I could get work, and I was getting work in the United States. So it was a flip for me. And this, notwithstanding the fact that I have, I would have hassles. We all have hassles at the border. And that I have had no desire to reside in the United States. But what it did for me in terms of the material conditions of creating is that it made me, at least it was a comfort to me, because it suggested to me that there was some value in what I was writing, in what the work was all about, and that what was happening in Canada had to do with what it had to do with. My challenging what I call the family compact in terms, and Canadians will know what that means. And so I, as I say, began crossing the border, or continued to cross the border to do work. Now, so what I began to realize is that that struggle in Canada culminated in a lawsuit that went on for some 7 years against one of our broadcasters who fancied himself a sort of Canadian Rush Limbaugh. And the silence grew and the isolation grew more and more. And it's out of that silence that Zong gets created. And actually, I had not realized it until I began to think about talking at this symposium, at this conference. Because Zong deals with the idea, I knew I wanted to talk about silence and how difficult it has been to speak silence or to read silence. But it's only in the last 24, 48 hours that I realized that, so there are many levels of silence operating within the text, and I'll talk a bit more about that, but that there was a very real contemporary political, cultural, isolationist silencing, I should say, that was at work in Canada and out of which this work was created. And oddly enough, or not oddly enough, things like this happen all the time. We all know as poets. As I was packing to leave yesterday, I got this in the mail from Wesleyan, but it's a piece by Kate Eichhorn, and it's an article in the Fall-Winter XCP, Cross-Cultural Poetics, by Kate Eichhorn on the multiple registers of silence in Zong. And Kate did a long interview with me a couple of years ago. And one of the things I talked about was that when I had done She Tries Her Tongue, many people talked about it as being a postmodernist text, and I don't have a problem with that. But one of the things I said then, and I still feel now, is that if it's only seen as a postmodernist text without taking into account that the Caribbean was postmodernist before the term was coined, in the sense that things like bricolage and fragmentation and all those things are very much part of what that experience is all about. And so she and I were discussing the idea of constraints, and because, as Janet said, what I did was to limit myself to this text. And what I said to her in response to a question, I'll just read what she says. I asked Philip if she would choose to write within a constraint-based poetic practice if she could choose not to. Her response was by no means purely and simply one driven by a desire to reject constraints. And this is what I had to say. In a word, no, but I've always been interested in the idea of limitation and its potential resources. But was that interest a result of my own history? Coming from a colony, that is, I didn't say that. Who knows? What is more interesting to me, however, is an insight about limitations or constraints I gained from the process of writing Zong. One of our founding cultural myths in the West is that of freedom. We can do or say anything within certain constraints, of course. We're free to go out and find our constraints, poach in other cultures, and so on. What I began to understand is that even when we think we are freest, if we lift, I want to say, that veil of freedom, underneath will be found many unspoken constraints. So what I was trying to explore in Zong was how to deal with the absence of meaning, or what meaning really means, how to write a history that has had a lot written about it, but what I came up with was how to not tell that which had to be told. And yesterday, coming through Pearson, we do pre-clearance at Pearson Airport. Because I think one of the things, and it gets back to what I just read, the quote of myself about freedom and constraint and borders and so on. I was saying to Sarah and Janet last night as they were driving me back, I get very nervous when I'm traveling to the States. 2 days before, Monday this week, and I kept saying to them, I have nothing to fear, so I don't know why I feel like this and so on. And then, where's Al? You say this is not being followed. But I realized I'm traveling under false pretenses. And what do I mean by that? In the sense that I have such a profound hatred of what that control means and has meant, first for First Nations people on this continent. And just to pause there, because that's also something I feel prickly about in terms of Canadian, American, and so on, that I have thought, I can only speak about myself, that knowing what I know now, which I didn't know when I came to Canada, about the genocide and so on around First Nations people, and how the Canadian state continues to use us as immigrants to blunt those demands. Am I any different from white South Africans who knew what was going on and yet continued and were sympathetic and so on? So there are many areas. I'm just saying that to show you some of where I feel as if I'm always on shifting ground. But when I say false pretenses, in the sense that so you get there, and I was thinking yesterday that I would love to do an installation. I've never done something like this. So they send you off to one side, and then they send you to another side, and we're in these rows facing each other and turning. You know the way they use the space. You're actually kettled. This was a word that came up in the G20. You're in the small area, and so for 2 minutes I'm facing this lady in pink, and then she'll be facing someone else, and so on. And there is this overwhelming acquiescence. You can feel it, and there's a silence, and no one's talking except a little boy and his mother. And we go through that, and then we get to security, where we begin to undress. We take off our coats, our shoes, our belts. And I'm praying that I'm not sent through the machine. I would prefer to be patted down and so on. And I see this tall white gentleman man standing in the machine with his hands up and so on. And now they can see into your bodies. And my thought is, and I'm going to end here, because to me it is the replication of what I confronted in the Zong. And now some people may say this is offensive to make a comparison between traveling across the border and what happened in the Zong, but because I belong to the group to whom it was done, I think I can sort of maybe play around with it somewhat. What do I mean by that? In the sense that Ian Bauckham, in his book Spectres of the Atlantic, raised this, that Zong is a repeating event, and that much of the speculative financing that we've all been impacted by today has its roots in the transatlantic slave trade. You could buy an African in Africa from Liverpool, have him or her transported to Jamaica, and then get paid later on via promissory notes and so on. But I was really struck yesterday by the embodiment of this, in the sense that now, with this, that was the first globalization, I say, the globalization of skin. The second globalization, what we call the globalization of finance and technology and so on, it's almost as if all bodies have become black now, as we move through these points, these borders of crossing, where we all acquiesce. In fact, maybe more acquiescence than the unwilling enslaved. Because we want to come to the States, we want to go to England, we need to acquiesce in this destruction, this invasion of the body. And I'll just end with a brief thing I wrote. End with the border between this and that, here and there. We form a sort of snake. There is the choreography of control, how we acquiesce in this control. We slowly move up, now facing this way, now that way. Sometimes I'm facing two tall blonde men. They won't have any trouble, I think. Then I'm facing a woman in a red coat, a buggy, two small boys. I'm behind a man who looks like he might be from the Middle East. Why am I thinking that? Everyone is silent. Eyes slide off each other, except the mother of the little boy who is talking with a buxom woman ahead of her. Two Asian women direct the traffic, one telling us she's giving us a choice of lines. Oh, joy, I think. Choice, the linchpin of democracy, as we're quartered like sheep to the slaughter. Once past the immigration, we undress for security, shoes, belts, hats, coats, and for the lucky, lucky ones, a machine that sees right into you. There was a time when they would examine your cavities and crevices manually. Now technology does that. And because I want safety, you want safety, we all want safety, we acquiesce. Yes, this is very, very different from slavery. Yes, it might even be offensive to broach a comparison, but we live under the pretense of liberty, under systems of control, and thus create from that place. Thank you very much.
Thank you, NourbeSe. So we have time for questions. Maybe I'll start things off, follow Julia's lead. It's really going back to what you said at the beginning of your talk about writing She Tries Her Tongue, both in the margins and then also as a frontier, or thinking of the margin as a frontier. I wondered maybe if you could speak about then, where is there a frontier in this, what you just painted at the end of your talk, in these sort of borders and the acquiescence to borders? Is there still a margin or a frontier where there's a space to resist or transform?
I would have to say I don't know. And even to the point, I didn't say this, but even to the point that part of what I feel, and why I spoke to Al, is that I feel that there will come a time when technology will be able to even see into our minds about what we're thinking. As I'm standing there with my passport and I'm thinking, whatever I'm thinking about this person who is going to allow me or not allow me into the country I want to go into, will they be able to see my thoughts and refuse me entry? So at this point, I don't really see, I can't think of any place yesterday where I felt that there was a moment of resistance or anything like that.
What about going back to your work, like in Zong, to take it back to the poetry practice?
Well, I meant to talk about this, but I'll show you. One of the things that I I felt at the end of Zong was that the way I worked on it, because there are so many things that I could have picked up on in terms of what Sarah talked about, but the Zong ship itself was a multilingual, multicultural, enclosed space. And when I looked at the text, I was limited by my knowledge of English, what I know of Latin, French, and Spanish. And then I picked up some Portuguese, some Dutch, because I thought I should have all the colonial languages. But I did feel that someone could come to the same text with another set of knowledges about language and find other poems in it. And a professor sent me, he actually had his class write mini songs. And when they came, I thought, oh yes, this is what I wanted, because they were able to go to the text. And I think some of them mind my own writing. But it was really exciting to read this. So I suppose in that sense, yes, that I think the form and the formal constraints and has created or have created some space where people can maybe find a way of speaking to it.
Fred?
I wonder if you could, I was interested in your delineation of your prose and your essays as activist, and I wonder if you could expand a little bit on that notion of activism and how that, I've always sensed your creative writing as activist as well, but do you make a distinction, a critical distinction there?
I make a distinction in terms of how I think you're right about the creative writing, but I think in how the two types of writing are received in the world. And maybe remember I said I didn't want to make argument in my poetry. So when I was writing She Tries Her Tongue, for instance, I was at that point vice chair of the Workers' Compensation Board. And in law, what you're doing is you are taking everybody's argument and then you're resolving it down to therefore X, Y, or Z should get money or shouldn't get money. And I was very aware that I didn't want to have resolution in the poems, that the contradictions had to hang out there. And it was one of the most difficult times of my life, because at one point I had have to be using my brain to resolve all these decisions. At the same time, I was writing this work where I didn't want contradictions to be resolved. I really wanted them to come up against each other. And English is my mother tongue, is my father tongue, is a foreign language. That was the reality. But the way the essays were received, certainly those that, I suppose some would say aggressively challenged practices and omissions in the Canadian state, I think it was seen as, and I felt that was my form of activism. Particularly at a time when there was a lot of activism happening in Toronto, in feminism and so on.
So do the essays, do you think they are seeking some sense of resolution?
I suppose you could say that, or some sense of change. Some sense of change, yeah. But I think change coming out of poetry works differently. I mean, it works in the interstices and in being able to balance those contradictions and so on, which is why it will be interesting to see what happens if this poetry reading does come off in terms of using poetry as a way to talk about Kiwis, to talk about the citizen, to talk about the state, Because to date, what we've done in Toronto is, the Arts Vote, which is a group that, looks out for artists. I don't think that they've really taken something like poetry to the politician. It would be interesting to see what happens if we deliver a collection of poems to Rob Ford, who can barely, make a paragraph. Like, what would he say, And what does that say about poetry, So I think you're right to challenge me. Yeah, I think maybe I was trying for some sort of resolution with those activist writings,
Yeah, I wasn't challenging.
No, but, yeah. No, it's helpful, yeah. Yeah.
I
questions? Michelle.
This is not meant to reduce the work of Zong, but instead to just sort of talk about maybe the project of the mini Zongs. And that how do you see that project related to constraint-based work, maybe on one side, and the documentary poem, Ruckeiser saying, how do you make a poem out of that? So that the project you did happening recently, how do you see it in between those two things? Maybe constraint-based poetry on one side and documentary poetics, though maybe they're more similar. I think they kind of are.
See, part of my prickliness about being here today too is my work often gets included with the language poets and the constraint-based poets and so on. But I feel that I'm coming at it from a different place, and I have a different project. Not that we don't cross over or meet and so on. And as I said to Kate, I think, and to come back to what I talked about, I'm not sure I'm going to answer your question, but in terms of coming out of a place and having as my personal archive, a colony, and the place of writing, and the place of rules and regulations and so on. And Lisa mentioned orality, which is a huge thing in writing from former colonial places. Because I was wondering as I was preparing this talk, because one of the ideas that is always, that I've thought about quite a bit is Ceylan's project of trying to work with the German language after the Holocaust, and how can you cleanse it and use it. And it's something that really hasn't come up in that way with English, although English has been so deeply, all the colonial languages, so deeply implicated in similar acts of brutality. And as far as I'm concerned, English doesn't really speak to me, but it is my mother tongue and it is my father tongue. So what I'm really interested in is, and going back to Janet's question, is trying to find a space in this language through exploiting whatever I have, whatever is at my disposal, rules, regulations, legal cases. But essentially what I come upon right away is the silence. It's always there. And how do I write that silence, which began back in She Tries Her Tongue, went through into Looking for Livingston, and is now in Zong? Because when I read Zong, and it's something I wanted to say too, I began reading it in a way more recently to honor the silences. And one of the things that Kate Icahn talks, how many of you have seen this piece by Kate? She talks about a reading that I did in which some people apparently felt that I manipulated them by holding the silence. And what was very interesting, it was actually at Barbara Goddard's, we had a symposium for Barbara, and in the silence, as I would read a word and then hold the silence, there was a wind storm outside that was howling. And it's very difficult for me to hold that silence, as I'm sure it's difficult for the people in the audience, and who some of them obviously felt put upon by my holding this silence. But it's very important for me to try and explore what that silence means. And as I said to you before yesterday, when I think back to the border, we're all silent. There are times when we're quite willing to endure the silence, because none of us wants to call attention to ourselves as we go through customs, right? So I'm not sure I've answered the question about the documentary, but I'm just still telling you what it is I struggle with as someone trying to write out of a particular tradition, and how that meets other traditions, as in conceptual poetics, and so on.
Lisa?
Thanks, Janet. Yeah, what you're talking about is something that really interests me a lot, and I don't exactly have a question, but I want to try to get you to say some more. So first, I'll just say a couple of things that I have been thinking in relation to what I'm hearing, which is the whole European Oulipoian school of literature, based, as we know, upon system of constraints, which has been taken up as a formal and aesthetic trope within experimental and innovative literature here in our moment and our, generally speaking, our places, while erasing the political urgency of its moment of emergence. I mean, I'm thinking of the Perec novel, what's it called, with no E's in it? The disappearance. And, you know, of course, the which has disappeared is his Jewish family who have been murdered during the Holocaust. So that the constraint is the specific violence of a political erasure, which has been perpetrated upon the living. Mm-hmm. So I've been very, very troubled by this sort of borrowing of what I see as the expression of this difficultly held silence within the body by the ancestors of those who have been murdered, ultimately silenced. The sort of borrowing of these formal tropes as aesthetic games. And I am also somebody who has played with systems of constraint as a way to generate interesting form. But I'm not very familiar with critiques which open up the political dimensions of poetics of constraint as specific expressions of political violence in the European landscape. Mm-hmm. So could you sort of just talk around that a little bit?
I think Kate's piece really grapples with that issue. Yeah, great. really well. But as you spoke, what I was thinking about, and this is what I meant by the throwaway comment that I don't think I could have done Zong if I hadn't written law. I hadn't studied law, because law is about constraint. And when you read that legal decision, when I read it, I knew that the voices were in that text. I can't tell you why, I just knew the voices were in the text. But here is a 2-page document that uses the word murder once and basically talks about, this is unfortunate, but this was a throwing overboard of cargo, and did give the ship's owners a new trial because the insurance company refused to pay them for the murder of the Africans, and then the ship's owners take it to court and they lose, and then they appeal it. Yes. And so the question for me then was, how was I going to get to those stories within the text? And that's what I mean by saying that I'm a fellow traveler to some degree, but I'm coming at it from a totally different perspective, because the histories aren't there. We can't go back more than 2 generations. No Africans were named. So when I called James Walvin, for instance, to ask him, well, because it was in his book, Black Ivory, that I first saw mention of this thing, and I said, well, do you have the names of the people? And he laughed. He said, no. And I'm sure all of you have seen Negro man, Negro child, Negro woman. That was it. So there is a feeling function that is working always with me.
Absolutely.
With this text. So much so, and maybe I'll end with this, so much so that the aftermath of this work has been quite difficult for me. And I think this event for me is maybe the beginning of coming out of it, because it's a very difficult text emotionally, even for me. It was difficult to write it. It is difficult to read it, and a lot of the constraint-based work doesn't deal. In fact, its whole function is to remove the emotion. And being a lawyer, I know that that's what law is all about. The victim impact statement, for instance, is something very recent because courts didn't want to know what the effect was on the victim, because that might affect the way you came to a decision. And there's a whole area of law called equity law that was set up just to relieve against the law, like what the law would result in. And so it was almost as if, pardon the metaphor, that I had to take this desiccated text that these judges had decided on and immerse it in some sort of water of memory. And then the voices began to float to the surface. But I think when I say part company, where I diverge from the constraint-based work is in that feeling function that is there. But at the same time, really wanting to sort of remain with something that, I don't know, maybe the bone of memory that, that is where I think it moves towards the constraints and sort of works with that, with language as language, and so to speak.
Constraint functioning in a political emotional field where the political and the emotional aren't separate is making a space for the dead to appear in. And this is something that is atypical within an avant-garde.
And I mean, I just want Patricio Guzman, some of you know, he did that wonderful film Battle for Chile, and made it some years ago, and I remember watching it a few months ago. And, with these DVDs now, wonderfully, you have an interview at the end. And he talked about the fact that for 10 years after doing that documentary, he couldn't work, he sort of had to confront his exile. And it was the first time I had heard an artist talk about the aftermath of a work, because it's not something that we talk much about. And I would like to talk to people about that. Fellow poets.
Thank you, NourbeSe.